Men. So have you ever wanted, well, I don't know, maybe not you because you're so young, but for me, I've always thought it'd be cool. Man, if I could go back in time and give younger Alex some advice on life, man, the things I would say, man, if I could go back to middle school and tell my younger self, hey, don't be a dork, okay? Just like be normal, right? I would do that. Or if I could go back in high school age and be like, hey, don't freak out about that, don't freak out about not having a car. It's okay, it's cool. Or if I could go back and tell myself, even just a few years ago, hey, you might want to buy a house soon because the housing market is just going to blow up pretty soon. Or Bitcoin, yeah, you might want to invest in some of that right now. I would go back and tell myself a lot of advice, and maybe you would too. Or maybe you wouldn't go back in time and give yourself advice, but you would ask other people who have lived more life than you, hey, what advice do you have for me? I'm in middle school, this is what I got going in life. What advice would you have for me? That is what Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians 10. He's using Israel as an example, saying that Israel went through a lot of stuff, okay? And we just read through Exodus last year. Israel, a lot of things happened to them, from being in Egypt, being set free, and then being in the wilderness and messing up through the wilderness. A lot of things happened to Israel, and all those things happened for our instruction, Paul says. All those things happened for our benefit, that we might know by their example what to do and what not to do. So it's kind of the situation of you're going to someone and asking, hey, you've done more life than me. What advice do you have for me in this season of life? This is what 1 Corinthians 10 sets up. And I want to go ahead and dive in and read it for us. Verse 1, 1 Corinthians 10, and it says this: Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. What is happening right here? Paul is giving us an account of Israel, saying, hey, you guys know that Israel, when they were in the wilderness, right, through the book of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, they went through a lot of stuff. They were baptized into Moses, it says. That basically means that they were following the commandments of Moses as Moses was following God. It says that they drank the same spiritual drink and ate the same spiritual food. He's talking about when God provided manna from heaven and when God provided water flowing out of a rock to feed and water the nation of Israel as they were wandering through the desert. Paul is saying, hey, all these things, all these really cool spiritual experiences happened with Israel. These things that God provided for them. God was with them. He was showing them the way. They were following after this example. But it says in verse 5 that God was not well pleased with most of them. Now, how can that be? How can it be that Israel in the wilderness, they're experiencing all these things that God is doing, making miracles happen, providing food, water, direction, a pillar of fire, pillar of cloud. God is providing all these things, but it says that God was not well pleased with most of them. And how can that be? Well, we're going to see how Israel gave into a lot of idolatry, and Israel was consumed with their own sin. And so the point that I'm getting at here is, for Israel, they had a lot of good things going for them. They had a lot of good things going for them on paper. They saw miracles. They were provided for miraculously. Yet they still didn't please God because they were disobedient, because they followed after idols. And so for us today, the warning is, it's possible for you and I to appear to have everything together on the outside, but still not have Jesus on the inside. We call it going through the motions. We call it hypocrisy. I lived through some of this in middle school and high school, of going through the motions of coming to church every week, of serving, but not really believing, not really letting my life, or not really surrendering my life to Jesus and following after him. And so it's possible for us in today's culture to come to church, to go to a Christian school, to serve at church, to be generous, to be kind to others. It's possible for us to do all these things that look good on the outside, yet in our hearts, we can still follow idols and not follow after Jesus. And that's the warning that Paul is getting at here. He's saying, hey, watch out. Follow after or do not follow after the example. Learn from the example that the Israelites went through of they had it all together on the outside, but they didn't have it together on the inside because they were still following idols. Verse 6 now says, now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust or we should not desire after evil things, as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, or for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So the Israelites are supposed to be an example for us of what not to do, of how not to go after idols and still try to have some spiritual thing on the side. Paul is talking about here in these verses, he's referencing he's most likely referencing Exodus 32, when the nation of Israel, if you guys remember the story about the golden calf and what happens during that moment. Moses and the Israelites are at the base of the mountain. Moses goes up on the mountain to receive the 10 commandments from God, the beginning of God's law. God saying, hey, these are the 10 most important things that you should do as a whole nation if you want to follow me, if you want to serve me. And so Moses was receiving those 10 commandments from the Lord. And the nation of Israel is down at the base of the mountain, and they're kind of like freaking out. They're like, where's Moses? We don't know. He just left. Is he going to come back? Did he just leave us here? Like, what are we supposed to do next? Who's going to give us food and water? And they're freaking out, and they don't know what to do. So in all their panic and anxiety, they decide, let's make an idol. Let's make a golden calf. Not like a calf here. No one, I don't know. Maybe they had like chiseled calves, from all that walking. Maybe, I don't know. But it was like a cow, like a little baby cow. Let's make a golden cow, set it up, and worship it, because we need something. We need some idol that we can worship, that we can look to, that's going to guide us, that's going to provide for us and protect us. And so they did this. They turned to idolatry, even though they had all these spiritual experiences under their belt. They still turned to this idol worship. And Paul is saying, don't follow after them, because they were idolaters. They were deceived. They were committing sexual immorality. They were complaining. They were tempting Christ. They were doing all these things. And what happened to them is God was not pleased with this. God was not pleased. And so many of them suffered consequences for this. But my first point for us this morning is that when we don't have the faith that it takes to, what I'm trying to say is Israel was in a place where they didn't know where God was. They couldn't see him. They knew that Moses was connected to God, but Moses went up on the mountain and they couldn't see him. And when they couldn't see Moses, the picture of the communicator between them and God, when they couldn't see that, they became scared. They started to doubt. They didn't know what to do next. And in that moment, they started turning to idols. And so my point for us this morning is that we look for idols usually when we lack faith. We look for idols when we lack faith. How many times has it happened in our lives that we pray for something, or we hope that God moves in a certain way, that he really comes through for us, and we don't see it happen? We pray, but there's no answer. We hope that God moves in the life of our family or something, and he doesn't. Or we have these hopes and dreams of, God, I really want this to happen, and it doesn't happen. And we're left with this feeling of confusion. Was there something wrong with the way I asked? We're left with doubts. Does God even exist? Does he hear my prayers? Left with this disappointment. Why would this thing happen to me? Does God care about me? So we have all these thoughts circling in our head when we can't see, when it's so hard to see that God is working. And it's in those moments that you and I often turn to idols. And the idols that we turn to today are not necessarily statues, right? I don't think anyone's going home and burning incense and bowing down to little statues on your tables. The idols that we have today, they look different, but they're still idols. I think most often for me, the idol that I create is really just myself, honestly. I say, I want to do this. I want it to happen at this time, and it's going to happen because I want it to happen. So I make myself my own idol, and I serve my own interests. And when I can't see God working, that's when I'm most vulnerable to turning to idolatry, turning to myself sometimes, or turning to other people, maybe turning to popularity or your approval from other people, turning to things that you own or dreams that you wish you could have this in life. And all those things that we turn to take our focus off of God. And an idol is anything that we place above God in terms of importance in our life. And so when I say, I can't see God working, I'm struggling to believe, I'm struggling to have this faith, that's when I turn to idols. But it's in those moments where I can't see him working that he's actually doing a work in me. It's when I can't see him, it's when I am struggling with this belief, it's when I'm struggling with confusion and doubts that God is wanting to work in me, wanting to produce in me, in you, a deeper level of trust, a deeper level of faith. And I want to encourage you that even though this life is hard and sometimes things happen and we don't understand why they happen or why we think, God, you didn't show up in this moment when I asked you to, I want to encourage you. 2 Corinthians 5 talks about this, starting in verse 1. Just follow along, just listen as I read it for you. Paul writes, "For we know that this earthly tent," he's talking about our physical bodies, our physical lives here on earth. "We know that this earthly tent that we live in, if it's destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands." Paul is saying, listen, even though we have this earthly body that's fragile, that's frail, that's susceptible to disease, to shutting down, to dying, we know that as Christians, this isn't the final dwelling place. Earth is not the final destination for us as Christians. Heaven is. And heaven, we have an eternal house built by God himself. And Paul's encouraging, so even though, verse 2, meanwhile we groan, we long for this. We're crying out in our bodies. We're saying, man, this life is hard. I don't understand. I'm struggling through life, through this thing that's going on personally or this thing in my family. I'm struggling with this. I don't know how to deal with it. And Paul is saying, we don't live by sight. Verse 7 in 2 Corinthians 5, it says, "For we live by faith, not by sight." We must live in a way where we believe beyond what we see. If you base your Christian faith on what you can see, it's not going to be strong. You're not going to get that far. Faith has to be something beyond what you can see. Faith that God is working his plan together for you. Romans 8:28, "For we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God. Do you believe that? Let that sink into your heart, that even though, yes, this life is tough, yes, we groan and we cry out in pain sometimes of disappointment, we know that this isn't the final destination. We know that we have a heavenly destination awaiting for us. And so in the meantime, we live by faith and hope in that truth rather than sight of seeing what's in front of us right now. So if the Israelites knew this, then they would have been walking in faith. They wouldn't have turned to these idols. So watch out. We turn to idols when we lack faith. And we should, in those moments when we feel like God isn't working, we should press into that. We should ask him for more faith in those moments. Let's continue on to verse 12 now, 1 Corinthians 10. It says, "Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you, such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will always make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it." Talking now about temptation, this temptation that is going to come when we doubt, when we fear, when we're like wanting to follow after idols and idolatry, saying, hey, temptation is real and it's going to come. But the good news is that God will never tempt you beyond what you are able. And what that means is not maybe what you first think. Like, what that means actually is that God is not going to give you something that you can't handle completely aside from depending on him. You're not going to be able to handle sin by your own strength. The smallest temptation for me, the smallest temptation for you is very, very difficult to resist in our own strength. By just saying, I'm gonna have strong willpower and I'm not gonna give in to this. Like, imagine if I set I don't know, what's your favorite dessert? Like chocolate chip cookies, freshly baked, right out of the oven. And I said, wow, here's this nice giant plate of chocolate chip cookies. Don't eat them though. It's like, and you're like, man, I really want them. Like, you're struggling to not eat them when I told you not to, but you're so tempted to give into that. And I mean, if it were me, I'd probably give in, take a little bite out of one. It's like that with sin, where it's so hard to resist it on our own strength. It's so hard to resist temptation by your own power, by your own will. But with God, you can resist. With God, you can withstand it. He will never put you in a situation where he will not be there with you to provide that way of escape that you can bear through it. But oftentimes, we see the way of escape, and we still choose to sin anyway, don't we? We see it's clear, yeah, I could just walk away from this situation right now, but I choose not to. I choose to stay. And then we blame God. We say, God, why did you test me like this? But God does not tempt anyone. God is not tempted by evil. He does not tempt anyone, James chapter 1 says. But each one of us is tempted when we're led away by our own desires and enticed. Another thing about these two verses is that God is not waiting to accuse us when we sin. He's not hoping that we fail. No, he's providing the way of escape for us. He's not saying, all right, I set Alex up, and I'm just going to wait till he sins, and I'm going to catch him. He's going to be in trouble. No, he's allowing me to be tempted. He's allowing me to be tested because he knows that it's going to produce faith in me. But in that same moment, he's also providing a choice. He's saying, hey, look, you can choose sin or you can choose the way of escape. It's your choice. It's your free will choice. And oftentimes we choose sin, but when we do choose to resist, when we do choose him over the sin, James 1:12 says, blessed is he who, when he endures temptation, he perseveres, because he gets the crown of life after that. You see, there is glory waiting on the other side of these trials and these temptations. There's glory waiting for us if we just say no and say yes to Jesus. Lastly, about these two verses is that the temptations that we face, they're common. They're not unique in the history of the world. They may look different, and they may feel like this is the first time that we've been tempted in this way. But all temptations, when you boil it down to the essence, they're very similar. They've been experienced through everyone throughout all of time. And that's not to downplay anyone's situation or anyone's whatever's going on in your life right now, whatever things that you're tempted with. That's to encourage you that, hey, you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to bear through temptation, bear through tests all by yourself, because they're common. People go through the same things. And so if you feel like, man, I can't do this alone, and I feel like there's no one else who knows what I'm going through, that's a lie from the enemy. People have been in your shoes before. People have experienced similar things. And it takes a vulnerability on our part to reach out and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. But people have walked where you've walked before. People have walked where I have walked before. They know what it's like. And sometimes it's easier to bear through temptation and bear through trials when we have someone who's done it with us, or someone who's gone before us and endured it. So that's an encouragement to you to seek fellowship with other people, to bear through temptations, to bear through these trials. Let's continue on. Verse 14 now. It says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Run away from it. I speak to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. In the next few verses, Paul is going to talk about some of the liberties that the Corinthians had. In the previous chapters, we read about how there's this issue of sacrificing meat to idols, and then is it okay for us to eat that meat afterwards? And there are all these questions that the Corinthians had, and Paul is going to basically say, hey, you can't partake at the Lord's table and partake at the table of demons. And what he's saying is you can't have your foot in both rooms. You can't be over here and hang out with the Christians and pretend to be, one thing here, and then do the complete opposite outside of that. So you can't be double-minded like that. You can't be two-sided. You don't partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. You can't do that. It's one or the other. And so he's urging them, hey, abstain from that. Flee from that idolatry, because you can't do both. No one can serve two masters, the words of Jesus. You'll either love one and hate the other, or you'll despise one and you'll serve the other. You can't pretend to have it all together in both worlds. Moving on, verse 23 now, we'll skip down. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify or build up. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Kind of on that point of not being double-sided is the idea that just because something may be allowed in the Christian faith, just because something may be permitted as a Christian, doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do necessarily. I think of a couple examples of things that we have some gray areas about today with, like music, movies, or TV shows, cultural media, that maybe some of the music that we're listening to, it might not be edifying, it might not be glorifying to God. It may have some pretty nasty things that they're talking about. Some of the movies that we watch, I don't know, they might be about some pretty dark things. Now, just because you personally can listen to a song or watch a movie or show that may have some stuff in it which might be kind of edgy, just because you can do that and say, I'm not in sin, don't worry, like I'm not tempted by any of those things. Just because you can do that doesn't mean that it's good for you to do that. Doesn't mean that it's okay for you to do that. Because Paul makes an argument, if you do something like that, if you, in their context, eat meat sacrificed to idols, in our context, if you walk the line of what is sin and what isn't, who are you bringing with you? Who are you showing weaker in the faith that it's okay to do those things? Like, for example, if one of the reasons why I personally don't use profanity is because I'm around youth. I'm around you guys. And I don't want to give the example that it's okay to say these things. It's okay to run your mouth and talk in this way and lead you guys astray. There are other reasons about that too, but that's one of the reasons why. Where I'm like, I care for you guys. I don't want to pollute my own mouth. I don't want to give anyone here the idea that it's okay to do those things in any way, because I would be leading you astray. And Paul is saying, you got to think about that with other Christians too. The freedoms that you have as a Christian, the things that you say, it's okay for me to do this. Is it okay for your brother or sister in Christ who maybe is a newer Christian? If they see you doing that, are they going to get the wrong idea and say, oh, well, I guess sin is okay after all? Are they going to get that idea from that? And that's why Paul is saying, flee from this idolatry. Don't even be around it to begin with. We'll close here, verse 31. Therefore, whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense or cause no one to stumble or fall into sin, either to the Jews or the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Verse 31 is probably, one of my, top 10, top 20 favorite verses. Whatever you do it all for the glory of God. And that's an easy verse to say and put on a pillow and live by, of like, yeah, I'm doing this, I'm living for the glory of God. But what does that actually mean? I want to try to give us a definition here. It's kind of hard to define God's glory and living for it. But I think a simple way is the glory of God is anything that displays his perfect love and holiness. The glory of God is anything that displays his perfect love and his holiness. And what example do we have to look to for this point? Well, it's Jesus. John 1:14 says that the Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us, the Word meaning Jesus Christ. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So when Jesus came to earth, John and the other disciples saw his glory. They saw his glory. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that he was like shining like a light bulb all the time? Well, a couple times he shone brightly, but they saw his glory by how he lived. They saw his glory by how he loved, how he served, how he gave his life in submission to the will of the Father, how he died on the cross, rose again, and gave everyone a second chance, redemption. And so for you and I to live and do everything to the glory of God simply means that we reflect Christ. We live as Christ lived. We love as he loves. We serve as he serves. And we devote our life to following him and trying to be like him in every good aspect. And so following that example is tough. It's not easy. There's better days and worse days for me. But it is possible. And I pray that all of you would discover the joy and the purpose and the satisfaction of living for God's glory beyond your own. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you.